So now we've established that Jesus actually existed. Jesus was a real person. If you missed that video, you can check it out right here, or you can go down to the description and find a link to it. So we can begin to turn to examine the claims made about him. But before we get to that, we have to ask, are the documents themselves reliable, or have they become legends? Let's talk about it. For over 2,000 years now, it seems that everyone has been talking about Jesus and an informed decision about Jesus. This is the biggest decision of your life, and let's investigate Jesus together. So we've talked about before that the Bible is broken up into two large sections, Old Testament, what we refer to as Old Testament, or a New Testament. And the New Testament talks about Jesus, and in the New Testament, there are some very big claims made about Jesus, claims that really defy biology as we understand it, and physics as we understand it, that claims that talk about the spiritual world. And these documents were written a long time ago. How do we know that they haven't become just mere legends? Like, you know the game of telephone that often kids play? My kids love it. Where one person says something to one person's ear, and they say it to the next person's ear, and it goes around in the group. And then by the time it comes to the last person, what the last person says out loud is nothing like what the first person said. You know the game. Well, that's kind of the question I'm trying to ask. Do these documents contain the original claims made about Jesus? We've established Jesus changed the world, right? Are the claims that are made about him, are they the same as the original claims, or have they evolved over time? And thankfully there is a system for evaluating ancient texts. We're not going to get too deep into this, but I just want to give you three really simple reasons of why we can rely on these documents, why they haven't changed over time. And I'll just go ahead and tell you right now, we are going to get a little bit further down into the weeds. So if I don't explain something super well or you're confused at all, just let me know in the comments below. But let's start with reason number one. Reason number one, the original documents were written early. Now, Jesus was crucified somewhere around 30 to 33 AD, and after that, his followers and others wrote documents about his life, death, resurrection, and other claims. How do we know that these documents were written early? I mean, are we able to go look at the original documents? Actually, no, the original documents have been lost, either through handling, because technology back then for paper is not the same as the technology we have now. It would have broken down much easier with handling, or there were other book burnings, scroll burnings from like Emperor Diocletian, who was opposed to the Jesus movement. Either way, we have many copies, and we'll come back to those copies here in just a minute. But the issue right now is when were the documents written? Some will date these documents later than what I'm about to show you. They will say things like, well, Jesus prophesied that the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed, and we know that temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And they'll say there's no way that Jesus could have known, it's not possible Jesus could have known that the temple would be destroyed. Now, I'll just remind you, we are not looking for what's possible, we're looking for what's most reasonable. And there are multiple methods that show us that the dating of these documents that sprang up after the crucifixion of Jesus were actually earlier than 70 AD. There's one method that I have come across by someone that I have a lot of respect for, has really shaped my thinking on all this, is by a cold case homicide detective named J. Warner Wallace. Wallace was actually an atheist himself who became a Christian after investigating a lot of the things that we are investigating right now. So we'll definitely talk more about him in future videos. But what Wallace does is he says we can know that these documents were written early, not long after Jesus' crucifixion, by looking at the book of Acts. If you're familiar with the book of Acts, it's basically a book of church history. It's got really key moments in early church history. It's written by a Greek doctor named Luke. Luke wrote two documents. He wrote Acts second, and his first document was what we call the Gospel of Luke. So Wallace says that we can kind of backdate these other documents looking at Acts. Let me just read what he says. Wallace says there are several missing historical events in Acts, including the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the siege of Jerusalem in 68 to 70 AD, and the deaths of Paul, a leader in the Jesus movement, in 64 to 67 AD, Peter in the same time period, and James, the brother of Jesus, who we know died in 61 AD. He says, the absence of these events is reasonable if the book of Acts was written no later than 60 AD. Luke wrote 2 New Testament books. He wrote his gospel prior to the book of Acts. So we have Acts that Luke wrote to include key moments in early church history, but it doesn't include several of these key events that should have been included unless Acts was written before those happened. Does that make sense? So Acts being written before 61 AD helps us know that the original documents were written early. And flowing from that, if Acts was written before 61 AD, we know Luke had to have been written before Acts, and Luke quotes from Mark. Look, I'm a visual learner, and I kind of need to see it, so let me show you this, and hopefully it'll help you see it. So we have Jesus' crucifixion in 30 to 33 AD. We have the death of his brother James, who's a leader in the Jesus movement. James died in 61 AD, so it's less than 30 years there. So the book of Acts would have, by this logic, been written before the death of James, and the Gospel of Luke would have been written before the book of Acts. And because Luke quotes from the Gospel of Mark, Mark would have had to have been written before Luke. Do you see how that works? It's really simple reasoning to show that the original documents were written early. Therefore, a lot of the claims that were made about them can be relied upon. But let's don't stop there. Let's look at the second really simple reason for knowing that these documents are reliable. The second reason is that the many copies haven't changed. Again, there's many methods to know that the copies haven't changed. But one of the ways to know this is that the more the copies that you have of an ancient text, and the older those copies are, the better for recreating what the original documents would have looked like. So an example that you may have read in like high school English class would have been of an ancient text is like the Iliad. And Sean McDowell, who's a professor and talks about these different things, Sean McDowell actually makes a really great point about the Iliad. This is what he says. He says, for many ancient books, there are often a few dozen existing manuscripts, and sometimes even a few hundred. Outside the New Testament, more manuscript discoveries have been made of Homer's Iliad than any other classical work. It's difficult to get an accurate number because there are constantly new discoveries and many of the remains are fragmentary. Nevertheless, the total number is far less than 2,000. So outside of the New Testament, the Iliad has more copies, whether full, partial, or fragmented copies, than any other ancient work. The Iliad. By comparison, the New Testament has more than 24,000 full, partial, or fragmented copies. It's just not even close. So many copies, the more the copies, the older the copies, the better. And when it comes to the age of these copies, at least one of the copies that we have is kind of cool. It comes out of Egypt. It's called John Ryland's Papyrus. And it's a little section from the Gospel of John, John chapter 18, that's dated back to about 130 AD. Here's the point. The many copies that we have of the New Testament, they haven't changed. Okay, so reason number 3 is that the many differences in the copies are immaterial. The many differences in the copies are immaterial. Now, some will object and they will say, well, you know, these documents can't be relied upon because there's many variances in these texts, like 400,000 or 500,000. There's like really large numbers. Some say even more than that. And the reality is that's true. There are a lot of variances in the many copies of the manuscripts of the New Testament that we have. The question, though, it really is what is a variant? And I thoroughly appreciate the work of Daniel Wallace. He's a textual critic This is what he says about variants. A variant is simply the difference in wording found in a single manuscript or a group of manuscripts that disagrees with a base text. He says elsewhere, you can't just look at the number of variants, you have to look at the nature of those variants. The best estimates are that 99.8% of these variants affect nothing. Most are spelling differences. There are different ways of spelling John. There are also different ways to spell Mary and so on. These variants are not going to affect anything. So when we look at all these different manuscripts and the different translations, there are about 180,000 words in the New Testament. Only 400 of them are material variants, meaning they actually weren't in all of the different manuscripts. Some of them included them, some of them did not. If you want to go look at those, we maybe talk about them later. You can go look at Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, and also John chapter 7, 53 through chapter 8, verse 11. These are included in many translations of the Bible, but were not in some of the oldest manuscripts. So let me go back through these points again. They're really simple, but I know that we kind of got down into the weeds a good bit, and we need to talk more about this at other points. But these three reasons are: the original documents were written early. The many copies haven't changed, and the many differences in the copies are immaterial. I really love the way that Greg Koukl, who's a prominent thinker on all of this, I really love the way that he sums this up and why we can actually rely on these documents, that they haven't become legends. This is what he says. If we reject the authenticity of the New Testament on textual grounds, we'd have to reject every ancient work of antiquity and declare null and void every piece of historical information from written sources prior to the beginning of the second millennium AD. Do you see what he's saying? If you're going to throw out the New Testament and say, well, we can't rely on those texts, then you'd have to throw out the Iliad and everything else as well. The bottom line is this, is that the claims about Jesus are the same as they were from the start. They're not legends. And my hope is that you will come to see what John, who wrote about Jesus, that you'll come to believe what he wrote. This is what he said. When writing about the purpose of his document, he said, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. There is no life outside the name of Jesus. That is why investigating him is so important. This is the biggest decision of your life. And again, I know my objective is actually to help you make an informed decision. You may come to a different conclusion, but I hope this helps you see that the documents can be relied upon. But we can't stop here. The documents are reliable, they're not legends, but what about the motives of the authors themselves? Couldn't these claims about Jesus be lies? Are the authors themselves reliable? Well, we'll talk about that in this video right here.